The Philadelphia Eagles clinched the NFC East by sweeping the Dallas Cowboys. The Eagles put up 41 points with two backup quarterbacks. Saquon Barkley became the ninth running back to rush for over 2,000 yards, and now the Eagles set their sights on the playoffs. Welcome to the Philly Film Room Podcast. Today, we don't just have another victory podcast. We've had many of them in this long and fun season, but we get a division clinching podcast. And it's even sweeter when you're able to clinch the division against a hated rival in the Dallas Cowboys. And then you add on to that Saquon Barkley became the ninth running back ever to rush for over 2,000 yards in one season, and you got to do that in a game against your division rival. Again, all of it just makes it that much sweeter when it's against the Dallas Cowboys. But I know for a lot of people, they are looking at the division and they're just ignoring it and moving on and saying we have bigger goals. And yes, we of course have bigger goals, but it's okay to take a step back and to celebrate your victories on your ultimate path to the end destination, which is the Super Bowl, right? Winning the division is just one step to climb the mountain. So it's okay to sit back, reflect, and celebrate. I know AJ was talking about how this game doesn't mean much. Winning the division is like low-hanging fruit, but he looked pretty happy celebrating in the locker room, taking pictures and videos with the guys, with his teammates. And it's important to remember that this is the only version of this team that we're going to see. There's a lot of guys that won't be on the team next year, right? So when you're in there with your brothers in the locker room, it's okay to take a moment to celebrate, to reflect on accomplishing one of the goals that you set out to accomplish at the beginning of the season, and that is definitely winning the division. Also, with winning the division comes with the fact that this team now gets a rest week if they choose to take it. Not a bye week because you still have to prepare to play a game, whereas a bye week you can prepare for your next game. They still have to go out there and prepare for the Giants game, even if it's going to be mainly backups playing. So it's not a bye week, but it is a rest week. Will likely be a rest week for the starters, right? So by winning the division, the Eagles also earn themselves a rest week. We wish that we had gotten the first round, the number one seed, so we got a bye week in the first round of the playoffs. But they do have home field advantage all throughout the playoffs, unless they do end up facing the number one seed, whoever that might be. But looking at this game in particular, and looking at the Eagles and Cowboys in their series this season, this was the first sweep of the Dallas Cowboys since 2011. So appreciate that. Their 62-point scoring differential was the biggest ever for the Eagles over the Cowboys. And then you add to that, they outgained the Cowboys by a combined 310 yards, and they won the turnover margin 9-2. So this wasn't just a sweep of the Cowboys, it was a total domination. Now, I know it was Cooper Rush at quarterback in both games, but you can't control who is on the field. You can just go out there and beat the guys that are out there, and that's what the Eagles did. When we look at this, at the Eagles season, really, and when I was getting ready for this review podcast, it really felt like a culmination of the regular season, knowing that the starters are going to play very little in the final game of the season, if at all. So I thought it would be a good time to go back and look at some of the stats for the Eagles during the regular season, and especially important to look at it right now and this week, knowing that their stats are going to be skewed a little bit with a lot of backups playing in the final week. But their defense is first in yards per game, third in points per game, and first in yards per play. They are the only team in the NFL to allow under 5.0 yards per play. So that is an accomplishment that this defense can take with it. They are first in passing yards per game allowed, which also accounts for yardage lost on sacks. But the crazy thing about this is this has kind of been a middling team in terms of their pass rush, or really in terms of their pressure rate. According to Next Gen Stats, they're 28th in pressure rate. Pro Football Reference has them at 27th in pressure rate, and Sports Info Solutions has them at 19th in pressure rate. So no matter where you look, they're really a bottom half of the team when it comes to pressure rate. They are average in sack rate at 13th, but they do have the third fastest time to throw against and the seventh fastest time to pressure. So you can't just look at the broad stats and say, okay, well, this team's not very good at rushing the passer. Are they the best team? Are they a top 5 team in rushing the passer? No, probably not. But when you look at the fact that teams are getting the ball out of their hands very quickly, this team would have more sacks and more pressures if guys were holding onto the ball. But I think part of that goes into the fact that the opposing teams understand that if you hold onto the ball for too long, you're going to take hits against this team, right? So quarterbacks try and get the ball out a little bit quicker. And you would think teams that get the ball out as quick as they do against this Eagles team would pass for more yards. But first in passing yards per game allowed is quite a stat when you add into the fact that they're not generating a whole lot of sacks, right? So I want to add one more stat to the for this defense. Their 22 forced fumbles is first in the NFL by 2 over the Pittsburgh Steelers. So we'll see what happens with the Steelers in their final game. Hopefully the Eagles can still get some forced fumbles with their backups. Warren Burks is probably going to play in this upcoming game. He had a forced fumble in the last game, so we'll see if they can hold on to that lead as the season goes on. They were 6th in total turnovers at this point in the season as well. When we look at the offense, they're 6th in yards per game and 7th in points per game. So the Eagles have a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense as well. And when you add into the fact that they had the 3rd highest point differential in the NFL, they ended up resting their starters in several of the fourth quarters, right? So these numbers, their points per game numbers, their yard per game numbers, really probably could be higher if their defense was worse and forcing them to have to get into more shootouts and not just be able to run the ball to end games and to pull their starters out of games early. When we look at Jalen Hurts, he's 17th in total snaps by quarterbacks, despite the fact that the Eagles are first in time of possession. He played 933 of the 1,088 available snaps. So it's not like the Eagles just didn't have a lot of snaps to go around. It's just that they were dominating teams so much that Jalen Hurts was getting pulled early from a lot of games. Saquon was getting pulled early from a number of games as well. Again, if this offense was pushed to be more aggressive, there's an argument that they have more yards and points per game throughout the season. But they're also 6th in EPA per play, 1st in rushing yards per game, and 1st in run rate, which also makes it that much more impressive that they've scored so many points and put up as many yards as they put up, because on average, you don't gain as many yards rushing as you do passing. And when you're leading the league in run rate by a good margin, that just goes to show how dominant that this offense has been at times, right? So when we look at this Eagles team, and I think it's a good time to reflect, this podcast is coming out on New Year's Eve. I think it's a good time to reflect on what this Eagles team has been over the past year and where they were just a year ago. In their final game of the season last year against the Arizona Cardinals, they had one of the most disappointing games of their season, right? But you look at this team exactly a year later, and they're significantly better. The Eagles defense last year was 30th in points per game, 26th in yards per game. The communication was horrible all around, especially towards the later half of the season. There was a void in leadership in many parts, and they didn't have key players at several positions. Then we look at the offense. They were 7th in points per game and 8th in yards per game. So the offense was still very respectable, but they had key issues like falling apart against the blitz. And then when we look at Jalen Hurts versus the blitz this year versus last year against the blitz, he had 8 touchdowns to 8 interceptions and an 80.5 passer rating. This year, he has 7 touchdowns to 1 interception and a 101.1 passer rating. So it's amazing what can happen in the course of 1 year with just a few tweaks, whether that's upgrading players at certain positions, letting younger players have opportunities to grow and to develop, bringing in a new coaching staff that can bring new ideas, whether that's on offense or just almost revamping the entire defensive coaching staff and bringing in a different perspective, new leadership on that side of the ball, and then really reevaluating previous philosophies and strategies. And I think it sets up well for, where we're at in this time of the year. I think it's, New Year's is always a great time of year to reflect on what you've done personally in your own life in the past year and what you can do going forward to be a better person and have a better year going forward. So I thought it just lined up well with how the season ended and where the Eagles ended. And there's definitely going to be some reflection on this podcast and this channel, what we can do going forward to provide a better product. But more information will be coming out about that later. When we look at this game in particular, because this is a review podcast, let's jump into this review. We're going to start with the offense because we have to. This day was really about Saquon 2K, right? The day when Saquon Barkley goes down in history. Whether or not they go for the record, he is going to go down in history as one of the select few running backs to ever eclipse 2,000 rushing yards in a season. And we're at a point in time where teams aren't really giving running backs the ball nearly as much as they used to in previous years and previous decades, right? A lot more running back by committee, a lot more load management that we're seeing really in all facets of sports. So when you see a guy like Saquon is able to eclipse 2,000 yards rushing in a season, it really is special, right? But that was the biggest storyline of the day. And this record isn't just for Saquon. It's also a record for the offensive line, right? And you see that and the picture that they took at the end of the season. All those guys that were in that picture played a part in Saquon getting to where he got this and during this season, right? And this is just also another milestone for Jeff Stoutland as well. He's been the best offensive line coach in the NFL for the past decade. This is just another feather in his cap and another reason why hopefully, I really don't know off the top of my head if position coaches have ever made the Hall of Fame, but if there's a case for a guy to make the Hall of Fame as a position coach, who better than Jeff Stoutland, right? But when we look at this offensive line and Saquon Barkley, they led the NFL in yards before contact per attempt at 3.8, according to Pro Football Reference. These numbers can vary site to site, but Pro Football Reference had them at 3.8. That is the highest since 2018 for a running back, right? So this just goes to show what Saquon's done behind this offensive line that has opened up massive holes for him for much of the year. Now, for his part, Saquon Barkley has led running backs and rushing yards over expectation per attempt. So you combine Saquon Barkley, like I've said in the past, Saquon Barkley is probably the best open field runner in the NFL. You combine that with an offensive line that is generating a lot of push, and you get a 2,000-yard season. When we look at this game in particular, the offense was clearly dedicated to getting him to 2,000 rushing yards. When we look at this team, especially in the second half, they ran the ball in 24 of their 29 plays in the second half. It was clear they're trying to get Saquon to 2,000 rushing yards, and then as soon as he crossed that yardage mark, they pulled him out of the game. So I think it's an indication that he's not playing this upcoming week. I think what they really wanted to do is make sure that he got to go down in the 2K club, and then they were going to pull him at that point in time. He did end with 167 rushing yards on 31 carries. So how did they get there? Really, it came down to a lot of persistence because they struggled running the ball in the first half, which has really been a theme through the previous 2.5 games, right? The previous 2 games and that first half of the Cowboys game. 127 of Saquon's yards came after a half. They only had 8 yards before contact in the first half. They had 68 yards before contact in the second half. Now, that has kind of been a theme in recent weeks, and I think a lot of people are looking at it as a Jalen Hurts effect. And while that is definitely a factor to a degree, you can look at guys like Rico Dowdle, who, since Cooper Rush has taken over as a starting quarterback for the Cowboys in Week 10, he's 5th in rushing yards, right? And he's been averaging 4.8 yards per carry. So it's not as if just because you have a backup quarterback or you don't have a running quarterback doesn't mean there aren't ways you can still run the ball. It really came down to, in my eyes, a lot of the issues came down to blocking on the offensive line, their tight ends, and sustaining blocks. That was the biggest thing that we saw in the Steelers game, the Commanders game, and really in parts of this game against the Cowboys as well. And I think no better play really encompasses this point as the play when Saquon Barkley was in Wildcat. They ran the very similar concept, the quarterback bash concept that they run with Saquon at running back and Jalen Hurts at quarterback, but they just flipped roles, had Kenny Gainwell and the normal Saquon Barkley role, and had Saquon Barkley playing the quarterback role, right? But what ends up happening is because of the run action to Kenny Gainwell, they were able to pull 4 defenders away from Saquon. And then what you had left was 5 offensive linemen for 4 defenders, and then you see Mekhi Becton and Landon Dickerson can't sustain their blocks, right? That right there, to me, encompasses a lot of what their issues have been over the past few weeks. When you look at this game in particular, I wouldn't say it's any one person's fault why they were having issues blocking in the first half, and really, and large part, and much of the second half as well. You had bad blocks by CJ Uzomah, really at times as a lead blocker, as a fullback. You had Johnny Wilson not keeping a defender pinned on a toss play. Lane Johnson couldn't sustain a couple of blocks. Mekhi Becton, his inexperience at offensive guard is really starting to show over the past few weeks. He has continued to string together bad days as a blocker, particularly as a run blocker. He had some struggles when pulling to kick out a blocker on some gap scheme runs. There was a particular play where he left his combo block early to block a linebacker at the second level. That likely wasn't his assignment. And he's not really sustaining blocks as well as earlier in the season. But here's the thing. The offensive line eventually got rolling, and Saquon Barkley made a number of good plays on his own as well. Saquon had 9 missed tackles forced in this game, according to Next Gen Stats. He had a really nice play on duo where the offensive line did a good job, but Tyler Steen, who played a little bit as a 6th offensive lineman to replace a tight end, trying to come up with different ways to mitigate their issues blocking at tight end. He didn't really do a great job in that role, but On this particular play, Steen was the 6th offensive lineman. He ends up on his face, but the run was forced to bounce outside. And this play really shows why duo is designed. It is really designed to leave the corner as the unblocked defender, because corners are generally the worst tacklers on the team, and we see why on this play. Saquon does a good job pressing the hole, forcing the corner to step up into the hole, and then bounces outside for a 23-yard gain. Now, when we look at the play that got Saquon Barkley over the 2,000-yard rushing mark, and it tied for the longest rush of the day with that duo run we just talked about, it was a staple concept that the Eagles have run since 2022. And just to point this out, they ran this play 3 times in a row against the Giants in Week 14 of the 2022 season. And if you remember that long Miles Sanders run against the Giants, I think it was like a 40-yard run, it was this play concept as well. It's a counter from pistol where they pull an offensive guard and a tight end. On this play, Tyler Steen is pulling to kick out Micah Parsons. And on this play, Micah Parsons is trying to spill the ball. What this means is instead of trying to keep outside contain on the kickout block, he's going to try and go inside and take away the interior gap and not let the run hit north and south. He wants that ball to bounce east and west. And what Tyler Steen does to mitigate that is he logs the spiller. This means instead of trying to kick out Parsons, he's going to take Parsons where he wants to go, and he pins him inside to open up a gap outside of him. Now, when we contrast this with the play earlier in the game, Mekhi Becton is trying to do the same thing, but he's just a little bit too slow to recognize and then to log the spiller. Then it becomes a play where CJ Uzoma, who is pulling around as well, hits the spiller and leaves a linebacker unblocked, and then the play is ruined, right? But on this play, Steen does a good job logging the spiller, doesn't allow penetration by Micah Parsons, and that gives room for EJ Jenkins to come around and just get enough of the linebacker that is looping around to kick him out to create a gap to run. It wasn't a good block. It was an ugly block, really bad technique, but he got enough of the guy and the play ends up working. Jordan Mailata pins the other linebacker inside. And then you also got good blocks by Grant Calcaterra and AJ Brown on the perimeter. And then Saquon Barkley gets the 2,000 rushing yards. Now, looking at some of the other plays that they had a really nice same side toss play. And it's a play that they've only really ran a couple of times this year, but once Tanner McKee came in, they ran this play multiple times. And I think it's clear that they really run this play with less mobile quarterbacks, because this is in their 3-by-1 formation where they have a tight end on the solo side. It's been a dominant formation for the Eagles to run out of this year. But usually when we've seen Jalen Hurts in the game, they're using the threat of his legs to give them box count numbers. But really what they're trying to do with the less mobile quarterback is create a horizontal stretch on the linebacker to the trip side where they have a bubble running away from him on one side, and then you have the pulling lineman and a toss to the other side, and it creates a lot of stress on that backside linebacker over there, right? But it's a changeup for the less mobile McKee. And overall, I thought the run scheme was very diverse. They run a lot of outside zone, a lot of duo, inside zone, trap plays, different counter variations. They try to get creative this week, knowing that they were going to have some challenges with some backup quarterbacks. I should say challenges, but they ended up putting up 34 points on offense with 2 backup quarterbacks. Now, 23 of their runs came from under center or pistol, 19 were in shotgun. That's 45% of the runs came from shotgun, which is below their season average of 54%, right? So there's definitely a difference in their strategy and approach and the run game this week. But when we look at their backup quarterbacks, it was a big day for the backups. Kenny Pickett had 143 yards on 15 attempts. That's 9.5 yards per attempt. He had 1 passing touchdown and was a hair away from a second, but he ends up getting the touchdown on a tush push. And ultimately, he had 119.6 passer rating. He had a big day, particularly targeting DeVonta Smith. He had 2 beautiful passes with great accuracy on a deep corner route to DeVonta for a touchdown, and then on a 49-yard pass to DeVonta down the sideline to set up a tush push. He had really good timing and location on a deep out route to AJ on the far side, and then he did a nice job extending and finding AJ for a touchdown on a play that was well covered and poorly executed. But unfortunately, that play got called back due to holding. He also had a big play to Grant Calcaterra down the sideline where he extended with his legs and found Calcaterra late on a 3rd down. He did panic early in the rep and probably should have thrown the out route to DeVonta Smith with timing, but I thought his performance was actually pretty up and down when you look at him throughout the game. He had happy feet at many moments in the pocket. He was inaccurate on a few passes, and he tended to be late on numerous passes where he just had an extra hitch in his footwork, where if he had played a little bit more on time, he probably would have been a little bit better, a little bit more clean. He still made plays regardless, but one of those plays where he was late nearly resulted in an interception coming out of halftime. Now, I will say this, can't overlook the fact that he was playing with broken ribs and he took some massive shots in the game as well. I've never had broken ribs, but from everyone that's had them, they say it's extremely painful. And obviously the severity of the broken ribs factors into how severe the pain is. But, a lot of reports say that it just hurts to breathe. So if it hurts to breathe, it probably hurts to play a football game too. So Kenny Pickett was a warrior for getting that one out. Now, I thought this was a great storyline coming into the game about Kenny Pickett, lifelong Eagles fan, getting to take on and clinch the division against the rival Dallas Cowboys at home. And it almost seemed, it's kind of sad to see, it almost seemed like people wanted Kenny Pickett to suck just so they could say they told you so about Tanner McKee, right? But Pickett is now 15-10 as a starting quarterback. There's a reason he's a backup quarterback in this league, due to part of his play, but also there's a reason he's still a backup, and it's going to be because of the fact that he can operate an offense. He can do enough to get wins in the NFL. But when we look at Tanner McKee, he gave the people what they wanted to see. He saw very limited action, but he was great in the throws that he did get to throw, right? He had 2 touchdown passes in this game. He was generally quick and accurate getting the ball out of his hands. He did have one inaccurate pass, leaving a pass pretty far behind DeVonta Smith. DeVonta made a nice catch to help him out there, but it was his first throw of the game, so I think it's understandable, or you could forgive him for being inaccurate on his first pass late into the third quarter of the game, right? But most of his throws were against cover 1, which does make it easier to grip and rip when you have one-on-one with A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith out there. So I do want to see an extended playing time. How does he look when he's forced to hold on to the ball, when he's forced to go through his reads and his progressions, especially against zone coverage, and when he's forced to create out of structure? He didn't have to do any of that in this week's game, but you give him cover 1, he's probably going to find the right guy, throw accurately, and make good plays. Hopefully we see an extended look from him in this next week. I imagine we will, with Kenny Pickett dealing with the rib injuries. Jalen Hurts probably playing very little, if at all, but he will be without the starters, so it's going to be tough to fully evaluate him when he's playing behind backup offensive linemen and with backup receivers. Now, looking at DeVonta Smith's big day, he had 120 receiving yards, which was his highest of the season. He really abused Andrew Booth Jr., and when we talked about this game coming into the game, it looked like it was going to be Amani Oruwariye that was going to be the matchup that they wanted to target, because he was one of the worst corners in the NFL, but he was injured in last week's game. He ended up finishing the game, but he ended up getting ruled out on Friday. When we look at Andrew Booth Jr., he's been a career backup, and although he didn't qualify due to a number of snaps, his yards per target would have ranked 135th out of 138 qualifying corners. So he was definitely the matchup to target on paper. The Eagles unleashed DeVonta on Booth. AJ was shadowed by Bland, so it was Andrew Booth Jr. who was matched up on DeVonta when he was aligned out wide. Although AJ did get the better of Bland whenever he did get targeted, the targets really went to DeVonta in this game. The Eagles aligned DeVonta wide on the 4th highest percentage of his snaps all season. The top 2 games came before the bye week, and then the 3rd highest game was actually the Week 10 matchup against the Cowboys. So it's clear that they had an emphasis on attacking the Cowboys with the receivers aligned out wide. And coming into the game, the Cowboys had the 2nd highest percentage of targets to receivers aligned wide. So that was definitely an emphasis for the Eagles. But this offense also had, and really these backup quarterbacks were able to have good days because the offensive line was good in pass protection. They only allowed 3 pressures on 20 dropbacks, according to PFF. And that was the Cowboys' lowest pressure rate of the season. Micah Parsons was definitely more disruptive as a run defender than as a pass rusher. And when we look at the offensive line, Lane Johnson was good as always. Mekhi Becton was, I thought, better in pass protection than he was as a run blocker. And going up against Osa Odighizuwa, who was top 10 in pressure rate and pass rush win rate coming into the game, I thought he had a good showing as a pass protector. Jordan Mailata was very good as well. We actually saw Micah Parsons, I thought it was weird by the Cowboys. In the game where Fred Johnson was the backup left tackle, they had Micah rush against Lane Johnson a majority of the time. And then in this game, they had, when Jordan Mailata is back, they put Micah Parsons on Jordan Mailata much more. Now, that's a matchup I probably would go with if I was a Cowboys coaches as well. But why wouldn't they do that when Fred Johnson was a left tackle? I don't really understand that. Anyways, Jordan Mailata was very good. He has an impressive ability to quickly refit his hands and push the pass rushers up the field. He did an excellent job staying square and not giving up inside counters to Parsons, which had been an issue in years past. But he has continued to improve every year. He's taken a big leap this year when you factor in the run game and the pass game. Coming into the season, I would say he was in that top 10 range, but with the leap he's taken this year, I think he is solidly in the top 5 of left tackles in the NFL. Now, are they going to play their starters next week? Are they going to let Saquon Barkley try and eclipse the rushing record? We'll discuss this more in depth in our preview episode with Eric later this week. But I'll just say this, in short, I've kind of flip-flopped on whether I think they should play Jalen at least a couple series in this game or not. And in short, I've flipped to saying no. But we'll move on from that, and we'll talk about that more in the next podcast. Now, moving on to the defensive side of the ball. They held the Cowboys to 268 yards, which was not close to the 146 yards that they allowed in the first matchup, but we couldn't really expect that to happen again. The Cowboys' 268 yards was their 4th lowest of the season. They were also able to force 4 total turnovers in this game, including 2 interceptions and 2 fumbles. Now, when we look at Cooper Rush as a starter this season, his 2 worst games of the season both came against the Eagles. He had 147 passing yards in this game, 5.3 yards per attempt, and both were second lowest of the season. First was against the Eagles. He had a 50.7 passer rating, which was lower than their first matchup of 61.7, which both were the lowest of the season for him as a starter. His 2 interceptions were also the highest of the season. He's now 0-3 as a starter versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Predictably, they struggled without CeeDee Lamb in the game. They tried pushing the ball down the field more in this game, and they had some success as he was 5 of 7 on passes between 10 and 20 yards down the field, but he was 0-3 in the first matchup, and he was 0-4 on passes of 20-plus yards in this game, including 1 interception. He wasn't pressured much in this game, but he got the ball out of his hands very quickly. His 2.30 seconds time to throw average was the fastest of all quarterbacks in Week 17 with more than 4 attempts. He had 3 passes batted, although 1 didn't count due to penalty, but we also saw pass rushers trying to get their hands into throwing windows, especially on screens, which led to some inaccurate passes. Now, Rico Dowdle had 104 rushing yards, which was the most rushing yards by a single player against this Eagles defense this year. And it was the first player that went over 100 rushing yards. I attributed much of it to a bad game by Zach Bond, and I guess it's really my fault because I gave out Zach Bond over 8.5 tackles in this game, and he goes and has 4 missed tackles on the season, which was a season high. But he was also out of position or hesitant to fill downhill on a couple of plays as well. The same was true of Oren Burks on a few plays, but I thought Burks had a good overall game. He showed a good ability to play off the defensive tackles in front of him, to fight through traffic and blocks, and to find the ball. He has better athleticism than Nakobe, but not as physical. He also had a bad coverage lapse on an underneath throw, not matching the new number 2 receiver as they were coming back across the formation. But I do trust him to step in if he does have to fill in during the playoffs. Overall, when it came to the run game, it was really 2 carries that boosted their rushing total. The defense still had a lot of stops and tackles for a loss. I'm not overly concerned about them going into the playoffs, especially seeing what they did to the Commanders running backs in the previous matchup. Now, when we look at some individual performances, we have to look at CJ Gardner-Johnson's interceptions. His first interception was really a result of film study and game planning by the defense. Double slants from the 2 slot receivers and trips has been a go-to play for the Cowboys the past couple of years, and the Eagles were prepared for it. They were playing cover 1, but CJ's alignment was pretty interesting. It played out like a robber coverage where CJ was roaming the middle of the field, but he was lined up directly next to Zach Bond. It almost looked like they were kind of bracketing the number 3 receiver, where if the number 3 receiver ran an out route, CJ would pick him up in man coverage, and Zach Bond would be the middle hole player. But the number 3 receiver broke inside, Zach Bond matched him, and then CJ Gardner-Johnson got out to the slant, robbed the slant, and then took it to the house for a touchdown. The Eagles had an interception for a touchdown in Week 17 of last year, but unlike last year, they were able to pull out the victory in this game. Now, when we look at CJ's second interception of the game, I don't think he was supposed to be there. They're playing a variation of quarters to account for the trips formation from the offense. It's often referred to as tricks, where the strong side corner will match the number 1 on anything vertical. The strong side safety matches number 2 on anything vertical, and the weak side safety is going to match the number 3 receiver on anything vertical. This allows the defense to play with 5 defenders over 3 receivers to the trip side. They probably had a pre-snap alert based on the offense's formation. The number 3 receiver aligned inside of Josh Sweat on the edge, which is an alert that he's likely to chip and release, which gives you like a 99.9% chance that he's not going to run a vertical route. So when they see that, CJ and Reed as the safeties are probably keying the number 3 receiver, and when he chips, they look to bracket the number 2 receiver. The number 2 receiver stems inside and then breaks back to the sideline. Reed points to CJ to take him and have him leverage the route over the top of the corner route, with the Gene leveraging the route underneath. And then Reed will go help provide inside leverage on the number 1 receiver running a post. If the number 2 receiver were to run an in-breaking route, CJ would then be freed up to help leverage the number 1 receiver. Instead, we see CJ eyeing the quarterback and turning into a playmaker to get the interception. Some people are saying that CJ stole Quinyon's first interception, but it's called a takeaway for a reason. You have to go and take it away, and that's what CJ has done. He's done that now, 12 interceptions in his 2 seasons with the Philadelphia Eagles. He didn't steal anything. He went and he got the football, so great play by CJ. Now, when we look at Quinyon Mitchell, he did have a rough game overall in coverage. I'm only going to touch on a couple of plays, but he did give up a first down on a comeback route where he had great position early, but he started looking back for the ball too soon, especially at that phase and the route. If the receiver was further down the field, then I could understand, but he probably shouldn't be looking back in that situation. He also got behind on a stutter and go where he started looking back early once he was beat. You have to get in phase before looking back. You are not going to run as fast looking backwards than you are looking forwards, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious, but it happens a lot with corners, especially young corners. They get beat, they start looking back. You have to get your eyes on the defender and chase them down to put yourself in a better position and then try and play through the hands. But the pass was overthrown, so it wasn't a big deal. But I do think teams are going to try and test Quinyon and Slay deep in the playoffs, especially after what we saw in the Commanders game, seeing a couple of the plays that we saw in this Cowboys game as well. He also gave up a curl on 3rd down where he bailed at the snap playing off coverage instead of using patient initial read steps. He's also playing with a high pad level, which caused him to step way behind himself in order to maintain his balance on the break. Still, he had good plays in coverage, like the play where he got in phase on a go route, where he was then able to lean into the receiver and look back for the ball. And he probably gets the interception on the play where CJ got his second interception if CJ doesn't undercut him. In addition to that, Jeremiah Trotter looked solid in his few snaps that he got to play. He had good pad level and hand placement taking on blocks. He was able to slip under a block when the center was climbing up to him on a run play. And he's going to be someone that we're going to want to pay attention to next week as he gets his first real extended playing time in next week's game, most likely. Interestingly enough, Avonte Maddox was the first safety up when Reed Blankenship went down in the 3rd quarter before coming back, and again when CJ went down in the 4th quarter. So it appears Sidney Brown might be either 4th at best or 5th in the safety depth chart. But that will be it for today's podcast. We will be back with a preview podcast, and we're going to be having a little bit of a different podcast than normal. We're going to have a variety of different topics that we're going to discuss, especially since it's going to be a lot of backups playing against the Giants. We're not going to preview that a whole lot, but we will touch on some of the backups that will be playing. So we'll have an interesting conversation that is currently in the works. But as always, make sure to like, subscribe, and spread the word. And until next time, go Birds.